Uh, so this week we're going to be talking about San Junipero, the episode of the series Black Mirror. I'm going to talk a bit about the plot structure of it, and we will. I'm going to be talking about dialectics a little bit, but where I want to start is with a big question that I don't have an answer for, and that I would like you each to sort of come in with some sort of formulation, some sort of idea about the answer for this. And the question is, as we move into science fiction as pretty much the genre that we're going to be dealing with for the rest of the semester, um, the question uh, is science fiction inherently political? And if so, is it inherently sort of liberal or progressive? And again, I don't know that I have an answer for this. It's just something I do want us to be thinking about. So one thing that we can say is that yes, there are conservative sci-fi authors. Like there are far right um, science fiction authors, even sort of classic canonical authors. The big one being Orson Scott Card, who's has some particular beliefs. But there are a contingent of conservative science fiction authors, it, historically and contemporary. Um, they tend to group around space opera style sci-fi, like far future science fiction, and and I want to kind of push that aside. We are gonna read a big space book, or actually a small space book, with Binti, but for the next couple texts that we're dealing with, we're talking about speculative fiction, speculative sci-fi, near future sci-fi. So this is sort of the question, and I think both of the ones that we're going to read end up in a space that we can say is progressive, is liberal, has the idea that technology ultimately like has a liberating power to it, and that sort of like humanist liberation idea is good. But I want it's something I want to have in mind, and I want you to be thinking on particular science fiction texts, whether like to take a basic one, let's think of 1984. 1984 is often read as being an anti-communist. Well, I mean, it was written as an anti-communist text, but it's written as it's read as anti-totalitarian, which is also true. Um, so it gets grouped in, it gets thought of as a progressive text, and certainly that's Orwell's intent. Orwell is a pretty leftist, pretty committed leftist writer throughout his career in ways that like are fundamentally. And I say this as someone who's basically like a socialist, if not full on communist. That his ideas are firmly in what we would call a sort of mid 20th century leftism. But at the same time, opposed to totalitarianism, which at the time it finds its embodiment in Soviet communism. So, in ways, it's a progressive text because it's against totalitarian rule, but it also like it gets deployed against liberal ideas like political correctness. So it is a text that ends up cutting both ways, and I think you can kind of see that with a lot of speculative level sci-fi. Sometimes when we think about dystopian works, like are these warnings against a potential future, or are they sort of fatalist? In which case they fall into a sort of political conservatism. Um, you can kind of I think Margaret Atwood is an interesting case with this. I think Handmaid's Tale is, in a sense, a warning of the implications of certain conservative political strains of thought. And then you have her later dystopian books, the Mad Adam books, which are about environmental collapse and have a bit of fatalism to it. And there's this question of like, well, what are your politics there? What are you moving people towards something better? Are you moving people towards activism? And there are a lot of answers that we could have to this. We could say like, no, it is it is as a genre not politically implicated on either side. We can say sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. We can say that that's not the work of a book. That's not required. That our sci-fi doesn't, that science fiction doesn't owe us a sort of a political message. And we've talked about this in terms of the novel in general, and how genre fiction often genres can often arise in relation to moral requirements for the novel. So we talked about Gothic and Gothic romance and noir as coming in these moments within their media where what's being produced has a moral character. The early novel, the early film, and that the Gothic in the novel and noir in film rejects that and introduces a sort of amoral narrative. So when we think about when science fiction comes along, you're talking about like Jules Verne, you're talking about H.G. Wells, and these are novels that are invested in the idea of progress, and progress in both cases with or in terms of early sci-fi has elements of capitalist progress, which Jules Verne is sort of unabashedly all for. Technology in Jules Verne is always good. H.G. Wells has a more ambiguous relationship with progress, and sometimes progress is bad. Sometimes we end up in a bad future. But what I want us to kind of ask is like, when we're looking at a particular episode of this show, the show is largely much darker than these, and it is largely the argument of an episode is here's a technology and here's how it goes bad and here's how it tricks you and it leads us to a sort of worse future. And I wonder about the politics of that, and I wonder again where that sort of situates sci-fi, speculative sci-fi on a political spectrum. So I want you to come in with sort of an example of like, this is a sci-fi text that is like progressive or liberal or leftist or like espouses revolutionary politics, or look, here's an example, and here's how maybe it plays back the other way. I did the dialectic move again, sorry. Or alternately, here's a sci-fi text that like is looking forward and ends up making me feel sort of hopeless, or produces a sort of a version of conservative politics. So it's just something that we're going to talk about, and I want to kind of plant that seed. I think it's an open question. I think there are arguments to be made either way, and we'll talk about it in class.